June 28th, 2001, a Thursday. The assembly line at the Belvedere plant in Illinois was running like it had for years. Workers fitting doors, bolting seats, snapping trim pieces into place. The cars rolling past were neons. Compact, practical, forgettable. The kind of car you rented at an airport and returned without remembering what color it was. One of those neons was different, not in any way you could see. Same silver paint. Same 2-liter engine. Same 5-speed manual transmission. Same cloth interior. But this particular neon carried a weight that none of the workers fully appreciated in the moment. It was the last Plymouth that would ever be built. No ceremony marked its completion. No executives flew in from Auburn Hills to shake hands and pose for photographs. No champagne. The car simply rolled off the line, was driven a few feet by a quality control inspector, and then loaded onto a truck. 73 years of history. 27 million automobiles. And it ended with a Tuesday afternoon's work in the middle of Illinois. The man who bought that final Plymouth was Darrell Davis, a senior vice president at Daimler Chrysler. He collected vintage cars. When he placed his order months earlier, he had hoped the last Plymouth would be a Prowler, that wild hot rod roadster that was supposed to save the brand. But Daimler Chrysler had already moved the Prowler to the Chrysler nameplate, so Davis got a neon instead. A fully loaded neon, sure. Leather seats, CD changer, sunroof. But still a neon. He had it shipped to a dealership in Florida where the dealer principal was under strict instructions not to touch it. No dealer prep. No removing the plastic covers from the seats. The window sticker stayed on the glass. The radio antenna stayed in its packaging. Davis drove it exactly 48 miles, from the dealership to a climate-controlled storage facility. And there it sat. 20 years later, that silver neon had 68 miles on the odometer and was worth more than any neon had a right to be. Not because of what it was, because of what it represented, the end of something that once mattered. If you had told Walter Chrysler in 1928 that the brand he was about to create would one day save his entire corporation from the worst economic collapse in American history, he would have believed you. That was the plan. If you had told him that same brand would die 73 years later as a badge-engineered afterthought, killed not by competitors but by his own company's indifference, he would have called you a liar. But that is exactly what happened. This is the story of Plymouth, the brand that saved Chrysler and paid for it with its life. If this story resonates with you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment about your own Plymouth memories. Whether you learned to drive in a Duster, hauled your kids in a Voyager, or just remember seeing that Mayflower hood ornament in your neighbor's driveway, those memories matter. They are part of this story too. In the summer of 1928, a young Chrysler executive named Joe Fraser walked into a meeting with a problem to solve. Walter Chrysler needed a name. The company Chrysler had built was only 3 years old, risen from the ashes of the Maxwell Motor Company, and it was already a success. The Chrysler 6 had proven that Americans would pay for engineering excellence, for cars that ran smoother and stopped faster than the competition. But Chrysler understood something that many of his competitors did not. You could not build a lasting automobile empire on expensive cars alone. General Motors had figured this out. They had Chevrolet at the bottom of their lineup, a high-volume, low-margin machine that brought customers into the fold. Ford had the Model T, and now the Model A, cars so cheap that factory workers could afford them. Chrysler had nothing in that segment. Nothing for the farmer, the clerk, the young couple just starting out. Nothing for the vast American middle that would rather spend $400 on reliable transportation than $700 on luxury they did not need. So, Chrysler decided to build a low-priced car. The engineering was straightforward enough. They would take the existing Chrysler platform, simplify it, use cheaper materials where they would not compromise safety, and sell it through every dealership in the network. The harder question was what to call it. This is where Joe Fraser came in. Fraser was not yet the industry titan he would become. He had not yet founded the Fraser Automobile Company or partnered with Henry Kaiser. In 1928, he was simply a sharp young man with good instincts and a willingness to speak up. The meeting, as the story goes, was running in circles. Names were proposed and rejected. Someone wanted something patriotic. Someone else wanted something that evoked speed or modernity. Nothing stuck. Then Fraser leaned forward and asked a question. "Have you ever heard of Plymouth binder twine?" Walter Chrysler looked at him. Every farmer in America had heard of Plymouth binder twine. The Plymouth Cordage Company had been manufacturing rope and twine in Plymouth, Massachusetts since 1824. Their products held together hay bales across the Midwest, tied down loads on wagons, secured livestock gates. Plymouth binder twine was as familiar to rural America as the sunrise, and rural America was exactly who Chrysler needed to reach: the farmers, the small-town merchants, the people who bought practical things for practical reasons and expected those things to work. Chrysler reportedly replied with something colorful about farmers, but the message was clear. The name worked. It carried connotations of reliability, of American heritage, of honest work, and it came with a built-in symbol. The Plymouth Cordage Company used an image of the Mayflower, the ship that had carried the Pilgrims to Plymouth Rock. That ship, viewed from the bow, would become one of the most recognizable hood ornaments in automotive history. Walter Chrysler announced the Plymouth at Madison Square Garden on July 7, 1928. It was not a quiet introduction. Chrysler was simultaneously acquiring Dodge Brothers in a deal worth $170 million in stock, and he was launching another new brand called DeSoto, aimed at the middle of the market. The Plymouth was part of a three-pronged assault designed to transform Chrysler Corporation from a single-brand luxury maker into a full-line competitor to General Motors. The first Plymouth, designated the Model Q, was priced at $675 for the base touring sedan. This was slightly more expensive than a Ford or Chevrolet. Chrysler knew this. He was betting that buyers would pay a premium for features the competition did not offer. The most important of those features was four-wheel hydraulic brakes. Ford still used mechanical brakes, so did Chevrolet. Mechanical brakes required more pedal effort, provided less stopping power, and wore unevenly. Hydraulic brakes were smoother, more effective, and safer. Plymouth advertising made this point relentlessly. In an era when automobile accidents were claiming thousands of lives each year, the promise of better brakes was not a minor selling point. The Model Q also offered a longer wheelbase than Ford or Chevrolet, which meant more interior room. It had full-pressure engine lubrication, which extended engine life. It had a fuel pump instead of the gravity feed systems still common on cheaper cars. These were not revolutionary innovations. They were proven technologies from more expensive vehicles, brought down to a price point where ordinary buyers could afford them. Henry Ford, according to automotive legend, warned Walter Chrysler to stay out of the low-priced market. The margins were thin, the competition was brutal. Ford had been building cheap cars for 2 decades and knew exactly how much suffering that business entailed. Chrysler ignored him. Within the first year, Plymouth sold more than 50,000 cars. Not a world-changing number, but a start. More importantly, the Plymouth gave Chrysler dealers something to sell to customers who could not afford a Chrysler 6. It kept people in the showrooms. It built relationships that would pay off when those customers prospered and wanted something nicer. By February of 1929, Chrysler replaced the Model Q with the improved Model U, which shared its chassis with DeSoto. The cars were initially sold as Chrysler Plymouth to reinforce the connection to the parent brand. But Plymouth was quickly developing its own identity, the Mayflower ornament, the emphasis on value and dependability, the farmer's friend. Nobody at Chrysler Corporation knew it yet, but they had just created the brand that would save all of their jobs. The stock market crashed in October of 1929. Within months, the American economy began a collapse that would not bottom out for nearly 4 years. Banks failed, factories closed, unemployment soared past 20%. Breadlines formed in every major city. The automobile industry was devastated. New car sales, which had peaked at over 5 million units in 1929, fell to barely 1 million by 1932. Dozens of automakers went bankrupt. Auburn, Cord, Duesenberg, Durant, Essex, Franklin, Graham, Hupmobile, Marmon, Pierce Arrow, Rayo, Stutz, Willys. Names that had once meant something in American life simply vanished. Chrysler Corporation survived. And the reason Chrysler survived more than any other single factor was Plymouth. Think about what happened to consumer behavior during the Depression. The people who still had money, who still had jobs, still needed transportation. But they were terrified. They were not going to spend money they did not have to spend. They were not going to buy luxury when practical would do. They traded down. They bought the cheapest reliable vehicle they could find. This should have benefited Ford and Chevrolet, and it did. But Plymouth was right there with them, offering comparable pricing with those hydraulic brakes and that longer wheelbase. And in 1930, Chrysler made a decision that transformed Plymouth's prospects. They began selling Plymouths through all three of their dealer networks, not just Chrysler dealers, Dodge dealers too, and DeSoto dealers. Overnight, Plymouth's retail footprint tripled. A buyer in a small town who had never seen a Chrysler showroom might well have a Dodge dealer down the street. Now that Dodge dealer could sell Plymouths. The low-priced car was suddenly everywhere. The results were immediate. In 1930, the first full year of the Depression, Plymouth sales doubled from the previous year. Read that again. In the worst economic crisis in American history, Plymouth sales went up. By 1931, Plymouth had climbed to third place in American automobile sales, behind only Chevrolet and Ford. This was the position Plymouth would hold for most of the next 25 years. The low-price three: Chevrolet, Ford, Plymouth. In that order, usually, but not always by much. In 1932, at the absolute bottom of the Depression, Plymouth was the only major American automobile brand to record an increase in sales. Every other company saw their numbers fall. Plymouth grew. The brand that Walter Chrysler had created as an afterthought, the brand that Henry Ford warned him would lead to ruin, was the only thing keeping the lights on in Highland Park. The Chrysler Corporation understood what they had. In 1933, they introduced a six-cylinder engine to the Plymouth lineup, finally matching Ford and Chevrolet in cylinder count. The new Flathead 6 displaced 190 cubic inches and produced 70 horsepower. It was smoother than the old four-cylinder, more refined, better suited to highway cruising as America's road network expanded. That Flathead 6, in various displacements, would remain the standard Plymouth engine for the next 26 years. It was not exciting, it was not powerful, but it was reliable, economical, and easy to repair. Exactly what Depression-era buyers wanted. Plymouth advertising during this period emphasized value above all else. "Look at all three" was one slogan, inviting buyers to compare Plymouth against Ford and Chevrolet and see which offered more for the money. The company ran newspaper ads listing feature after feature, showing how Plymouth matched or exceeded the competition at every price point. By August of 1934, Plymouth built its 1 millionth car. This was a milestone that had taken Ford 12 years to reach and Chevrolet 9 years. Plymouth had done it in 6. The pace of growth was extraordinary. When that millionth car was approaching production, Walter Chrysler received a telegram from a woman in California named Ethel Miller. She had taken her 1928 Model Q into a local dealer for service, and during the work, the mechanic noticed something. Her car had one of the earliest serial numbers. It was, in fact, the very first Plymouth ever built. Mrs. Miller had been driving Plymouth No. 1 for 6 years, putting over 70,000 miles on it, using it for daily transportation without knowing its significance. The car had simply worked day after day, year after year, exactly as Walter Chrysler had promised it would. In 1939, Plymouth produced 417,000 vehicles. At the New York World's Fair that year, they displayed a convertible coupe with a power-folding top, the first mass-production convertible to offer that feature. The car was built at Chrysler's exhibit, where visitors could watch the assembly process and imagine themselves behind the wheel. By 1940 and 41, Plymouth was threatening to overtake Ford for second place in American sales. The numbers were close enough that industry observers began to wonder if a reshuffling of the low-price 3 was imminent. Ford had dominated the number 2 position for so long that most people assumed it was permanent. Plymouth was proving otherwise. And then, in August of 1940, Walter Chrysler died. He had been in declining health for years, forced to step back from day-to-day management of the company he had built. But he had remained chairman of the board, a presence, a reminder of where Chrysler Corporation came from and what it stood for. His death removed that anchor. Plymouth would continue to sell. It would continue to be profitable, but it had lost its champion, the man who understood intuitively that a company needed a low-priced car to survive, and that car needed its own identity, its own personality, its own reason to exist beyond simply being cheaper than the parent brand. The orphan era had begun. The Second World War interrupted everything. Automobile production ceased as factories converted to military manufacturing. Chrysler built tanks, aircraft engines, radar equipment, and anti-aircraft guns. Plymouth workers who had been fitting doors and painting fenders were now assembling weapons that would be shipped across 2 oceans. When civilian production resumed in 1946, Americans were desperate for new cars. Wartime rationing had prevented most families from buying vehicles for 4 years. The backlog of demand was enormous. Automakers could sell essentially anything with 4 wheels and an engine. Plymouth sold plenty of cars in those immediate post-war years, but the vehicles themselves were warmed over pre-war designs. This was true across the industry. Ford, Chevrolet, everyone was rushing to meet demand with whatever they could produce. Styling innovation took a back seat to simply getting metal into showrooms. The problem for Plymouth was that this temporary situation became permanent under the leadership of Kaufman Thuma Keller, known throughout the industry as K.T. Keller. He had succeeded Walter Chrysler as president and took a very different view of what automobiles should be. Keller was an engineer by training and temperament. He believed in durability, in practicality, in conservative design that would not date quickly. He was famous for insisting that a man should be able to wear a hat while driving. This was not a joke. Keller thought the trend toward lower rooflines was a mistake, that it sacrificed interior comfort for styling flash. Under Keller's leadership, Chrysler products grew boxy and upright, while Ford and General Motors went sleek and low. The 1949 Ford was a revelation, a car that looked like the future. The 1949 Plymouth looked like the past. Sales began to slip, not catastrophically. Plymouth was still selling hundreds of thousands of cars per year, but market share was eroding. The low-price 3 was becoming the low-price 2.5. With Plymouth trailing further and further behind Chevrolet and Ford. By the early 1950s, Chrysler Corporation was in trouble. Styling was part of it. Quality and reliability remained strong, but buyers were choosing flash over substance. The company that had risen to number 2 in the industry during the Depression had fallen to 3rd, then threatened to fall further. Something had to change. His name was Virgil Exner, and he arrived at Chrysler in 1949 with a reputation, a vision, and a chip on his shoulder. Exner had spent years at Studebaker, where he designed some of the most admired cars of the late 40s. But a dispute with the legendary Raymond Loewy had forced him out, and Chrysler picked him up to run their advanced styling studio. For the first several years, his influence was limited. K.T. Keller still ran the company, and Keller did not care about fins or chrome or the shape of a headlight bezel. But Keller retired in 1954, and suddenly Exner had an opening. The new leadership understood that Chrysler was falling behind. They gave Exner the resources and the authority to redesign the entire product line. Every brand, every model, everything. What Exner created was called the forward look, and it transformed American automotive design. The 1955 Plymouths were longer, lower, and wider than anything the brand had ever produced. The rooflines swept back in clean, unbroken curves. The front ends featured a distinctive grille and quad headlights that would become a Chrysler signature. The overall impression was of motion, of speed, even when the car was standing still. Chrysler marketed the new design as the $100 million look, referencing the massive investment required to retool every factory and redesign every vehicle. Plymouth advertising showed the cars against modernist backgrounds, emphasizing their space-age styling, their break from the boxy past. The market responded immediately. Plymouth sales in 1955 exceeded 705,000 units, the best year in the brand's history to that point. Buyers who had been choosing Chevrolet or Ford for the styling were suddenly giving Plymouth a second look. The forward look had worked. For 1956, Exner evolved the design, adding tail fins that had been absent from the initial forward look cars. Plymouth introduced the Fury that year as a limited production performance model, painted white and gold, powered by a high-compression V8 that could embarrass much more expensive machinery. The Fury name would become one of Plymouth's most enduring, but it was 1957 that truly shook the industry. The Chrysler Corporation products for that model year were so dramatically styled, so low and long and finned, that the company's advertising slogan was, "Suddenly it's 1960. The implication was clear. While Ford and Chevrolet were designing for the present, Chrysler had leaped 3 years into the future, and it was true. When General Motors designers saw the 1957 Chrysler products, they panicked. The cars were stunning. They made the competition look old overnight. Chuck Jordan, who would later become GM's design chief, remembered walking around a new Plymouth and feeling physically sick at how far behind his own company had fallen. Plymouth sales for 1957 hit 726,000 units, another record. The forward look had accomplished everything Exner hoped it would. But there was a problem. Several problems, actually. In the rush to get the revolutionary new designs into production, Chrysler had cut corners on quality control. The 1957 cars were prone to rust. Water leaked into body panels and collected in places where it should not have been. Paint bubbled. Fenders corroded. Cars that were only a few years old looked like they had been parked in salt water. The assembly was also sloppy. Doors did not align properly. Trim pieces fell off. Engines developed problems that should have been caught before the cars ever left the factory. Chrysler's reputation for quality, built over 3 decades, took a serious hit. Then came 1962 and the downsizing disaster. Virgil Exner had been working on a new generation of cars, full-sized vehicles that would continue the forward-look evolution. But someone at Chrysler heard a rumor. General Motors was supposedly planning to downsize their big cars dramatically for 1962. If Chrysler showed up with traditional full-size vehicles while Chevrolet and Ford went smaller, they would be caught flat-footed. The order came down to shrink the new Plymouths and Dodges. Exner protested. He had already designed a beautiful full-size Plymouth. Cutting it down would ruin the proportions, destroy the visual balance he had worked so hard to achieve. His objections were overruled. The 1962 Plymouth arrived with awkward styling, a pinched look that pleased almost nobody. One reviewer compared the Dodge version to an angry warthog. The proportions were wrong. The fins looked stunted. The cars seemed to be neither one thing nor another, too small to compete with Ford and Chevrolet's full-sized offerings, too large to compete with the new compact cars. And the rumor about GM downsizing? It turned out to be about the Chevy 2, a compact car. The full-sized Impalas and Bel Airs were as large as ever. Plymouth sales collapsed. Rambler, of all brands, briefly passed Plymouth for 3rd place in the industry. The brand that had saved Chrysler during the Depression was now struggling to stay relevant. Virgil Exner, already weakened by a heart attack, was pushed out. His vision had transformed Chrysler, but his final products had been compromised by corporate panic, and he took the blame. Plymouth would recover. But the lesson of the forward look was complicated. Styling could save a brand. Styling could also destroy one if the execution fell short, or the decision-makers lost their nerve. If you are old enough to remember seeing a 1957 Plymouth on the street, you know what those cars looked like. You know the presence they had. And if you ever watched the movie Christine, you saw that presence transformed into something darker. Stephen King chose a 1958 Plymouth Fury for his novel about a possessed car specifically because, as he put it, the Fury was a forgotten car. By the early 1980s, those beautiful forward-look designs had faded from public memory. King brought one back to terrifying life. The muscle car era arrived in 1964 when Pontiac dropped a large V8 into a mid-size body and called it the GTO. Within months, every American automaker was scrambling to respond. Plymouth's first answer was the Barracuda, a fastback coupe based on the compact Valiant platform. The Barracuda actually beat the Ford Mustang to market by 2 weeks in the spring of 1964. This should have been a triumph. Plymouth had the jump on what would become the most successful automotive launch of the decade. But the Barracuda was too clearly a Valiant with a new roofline. The Mustang, by contrast, looked like something entirely new. Ford sold over 400,000 Mustangs in the first year. Plymouth sold fewer than 24,000 Barracudas. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout the muscle car era. Plymouth had the hardware. They had the engines, the engineering, the racing pedigree. What they lacked was the marketing magic that transformed a car from a product into a phenomenon. By 1967, Plymouth was ready to try something different. They introduced the GTX, a mid-size satellite with every performance option standard: bucket seats, heavy-duty suspension, a 440 cubic inch V8 producing 375 horsepower. This was the gentleman's muscle car, a vehicle for buyers who wanted speed without the boy racer image. The GTX sold respectably, but the real breakthrough came a year later with the Roadrunner. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Take the basic Belvedere body, strip out everything that did not contribute to going fast, and price it below $3,000. No fancy interior, bench seats covered in vinyl, rubber floor mats instead of carpet, a bare-bones dashboard. The only luxuries were a massive engine, and the hardware needed to handle it. Plymouth's marketing team wanted to license the Roadrunner character from Warner Brothers. The cartoon bird that constantly outwitted Wile E. Coyote was perfect for the car's personality. Fast, simple, cheerful, unstoppable. Warner Brothers agreed, and for the first time in automotive history, a car came with cartoon decals and a horn that went beep beep. The horn was ridiculous. That was the point. The Roadrunner was a car that did not take itself too seriously, even as it took performance very seriously indeed. The base engine was a specially tuned 383 cubic inch V8, producing 335 horsepower. For buyers who wanted more, the 426 Hemi was available, 7 liters of displacement and 425 horsepower that could propel the Roadrunner through the quarter mile in the low 13-second range. Plymouth expected to sell perhaps 5,000 Roadrunners in the first year. They sold over 45,000. The car had tapped into something. Young buyers wanted performance, but they did not want to pay Corvette prices. The Roadrunner gave them exactly what they wanted at a price they could afford. By 1970, Plymouth had assembled what they called the Rapid Transit System. The Roadrunner and GTX on the midsize platform, the Barracuda and its high-performance CUDA variant on the pony car platform, the Duster 340 on the compact platform, and even a Sport Fury GT on the full-size platform. Every size category had a Plymouth muscle car. But the crowning achievement of Plymouth's muscle era was a car so extreme, so purpose-built, that it remains one of the most recognizable automobiles ever produced: the Superbird. Richard Petty was the king of NASCAR, winner of more races than any driver in history. For years, he had driven Plymouths, winning an astonishing 27 races in 1967 alone. But by 1968, Petty was frustrated. Plymouth was not giving him competitive equipment. Dodge had introduced the Charger 500 with aerodynamic modifications that improved high-speed performance. Petty wanted something similar. Plymouth said no. So, Petty left. He signed with Ford for the 1969 season and won the first race he entered. Chrysler management was stunned. Losing Richard Petty was a public relations disaster. The most famous driver in American racing, a man whose name was synonymous with Plymouth, was now driving Fords. Something had to be done. What they did was hire a rocket scientist. Gary Romberg had spent the 1960s at NASA working on the space program. In early 1969, with the Apollo project winding down, Romberg moved to Chrysler's motorsports division. His job was to make Plymouths slip through the air at 200 miles per hour. Romberg and his team spent months in a wind tunnel at Wichita State University, testing shapes, refining designs, solving the aerodynamic problems that limited speed on NASCAR's superspeedways. The result was the Superbird, a modified Roadrunner with a nose cone extending nearly 2 feet beyond the front bumper and a rear wing standing over 2 feet tall. The car looked like nothing else on the road. Many people thought it was ugly. But aerodynamics do not care about beauty. The Superbird could sustain speeds that no previous stock car had achieved. The plan worked. Richard Petty came back to Plymouth for 1970. He won 8 races driving the Superbird. and other Superbird pilots added 10 more victories. The winged Plymouths won 18 of the races they entered that season. NASCAR's homologation rules required manufacturers to sell a minimum number of street-legal versions of their race cars. For 1970, that number was one car for every 2 dealers. Plymouth had approximately 960 dealers, so they needed to build at least 1,920 Superbirds for public sale. They built them, and initially, many of them sat unsold. The styling that worked brilliantly on a racetrack was too extreme for grocery store parking lots. Dealers discounted the cars heavily, converted some of them back to standard roadrunners, did whatever they could to move them off the lots. Today, a 1970 Superbird with a Hemi engine can sell for over $2 million. Richard Petty's personal Superbird was offered at auction with a $3.5 million bid that did not meet the reserve. The cars that dealers once struggled to give away have become among the most valuable American automobiles ever produced. But the muscle car era was ending. By 1971, insurance companies had caught on. Young men driving high-powered cars were filing claims at alarming rates. Premiums skyrocketed. A 19-year-old buying a Hemi Roadrunner might pay more for insurance than for the car itself. Emissions regulations tightened simultaneously. The big engines that produced such impressive horsepower numbers were also producing unacceptable levels of pollution. Compression ratios dropped. Power fell. The 335 horsepower 383 of 1968 became the 255 horsepower 400 of 1972. Same displacement, same basic engine, but neutered to meet federal requirements. The 1973 oil embargo delivered the final blow. Gas lines stretched around blocks. Fuel prices doubled, then doubled again. The idea of a car that got 10 miles to the gallon suddenly seemed not just expensive, but unpatriotic. Plymouth's muscle cars faded away. The Roadrunner name survived through 1980, but the cars it adorned were pale shadows of the originals. The GTX was gone by 1971. The Barracuda disappeared after 1974, killed by a combination of emissions requirements and declining sales. An era had ended. Plymouth had been there at the height of it, building some of the most memorable cars in American history. But the company was about to face challenges that would make the end of muscle cars look like a minor inconvenience. The Plymouth Volare was supposed to save everything. By the mid-1970s, Chrysler Corporation was struggling. The compact Valiant had been in production since 1960 with only modest updates. It was reliable but dated, a car from another era. Ford had the Maverick. Chevrolet had the Nova. Plymouth needed something new. The Volare arrived for 1976 as a thoroughly modern compact car. Transverse torsion bar suspension for a smoother ride. Updated styling that looked contemporary without being radical. Available as a coupe, sedan, or wagon to cover every market segment. Motor Trend magazine named it Car of the Year. Then the recalls started. The first was for a fender problem that allowed water to collect and cause stalling in wet weather. Then came a recall for carburetor issues, then hood latches, then brakes, then rust. The Volare became one of the most recalled vehicles in American history. Its initial acclaim buried under an avalanche of warranty claims and customer complaints. Chrysler's reputation for quality, already damaged by the 1957 rust problems, took another devastating hit. Buyers who had trusted the company for decades began shopping elsewhere. Sales of all Chrysler products declined. The company's problems extended far beyond one troubled car. Chrysler had expanded aggressively into Europe during the 1960s and 70s, acquiring operations in France, Britain, and Spain. Those European divisions were hemorrhaging money. The oil crisis had caught Chrysler with a lineup weighted heavily toward large, fuel-inefficient vehicles. Management had failed to anticipate the shift toward smaller cars. By 1978, Chrysler Corporation was losing over $1 million per day. The European operations were sold to Peugeot for $1. Yes, $1. Chrysler paid Peugeot to take the European business off their hands. Into this disaster walked Lee Iacocca. Iacocca had been president of Ford, the man who created the Mustang, one of the most successful automotive executives in American history. Then Henry Ford II fired him in one of the most notorious personality clashes the industry had ever seen. Ford reportedly told Iacocca, "Sometimes you just don't like somebody." That was the extent of the explanation. Chrysler chairman John Ricardo recruited Iacocca as president in November 1978. Within months, it became clear that the company's problems were even worse than the public numbers suggested. Chrysler was not just losing money, it was running out of cash. Without an infusion of capital, the company would be bankrupt within months. Ricardo resigned, believing the company would have better luck seeking government help under new leadership. Iacocca became chairman on September 20th, 1979. His first major act was to ask the United States government for $1.5 billion in loan guarantees. The request was controversial. Free market purists argued that the government should not bail out failing companies. If Chrysler could not compete, it should be allowed to die. Others pointed to the hundreds of thousands of jobs at stake, not just at Chrysler, but at suppliers and dealers across the country. Iacocca testified before Congress, arguing that Chrysler's problems were partly caused by government regulations that had forced costly changes to vehicle designs. He promised that, with temporary support, the company could return to profitability. He was persuasive. The Chrysler Corporation Loan Guarantee Act passed Congress in December 1979 and was signed by President Carter. Chrysler received its loan guarantees, but the money came with strings. The company had to obtain $2 billion in additional concessions from other sources. Wages were cut. Plants were closed. Suppliers were squeezed. The United Auto Workers accepted contract modifications that would have been unthinkable in better times. Plymouth's role in the rescue was the Reliant. The K-car platform, designated by an internal code letter that reportedly stood for nothing in particular, was Chrysler's bet on survival. It was front-wheel drive, fuel-efficient, and designed to be adapted into dozens of different vehicles. The Plymouth Reliant and Dodge Aries were the first K-cars, introduced for 1981. They were not exciting cars. They were boxy, practical, equipped with four-cylinder engines that emphasized economy over performance. But they were exactly what the market wanted in 1981. Gas prices were high. A recession was biting. Buyers wanted reliable transportation at a reasonable price, and the K-cars delivered. Plymouth sold over 150,000 Reliants in the first year. Combined with Aries sales, Chrysler moved more than 400,000 K-cars, replacing the disastrous Volare and Aspen with vehicles that actually worked. The rescue had begun. By 1983, Chrysler had repaid its government-guaranteed loans in full, several years ahead of schedule. Iacocca became a celebrity, appearing in television commercials, writing a best-selling autobiography, even being mentioned as a potential presidential candidate. He had saved Chrysler, but in saving Chrysler, he had begun the process that would eventually kill Plymouth. Badge engineering is the practice of selling essentially the same vehicle under different brand names with minimal differentiation. It is an efficient way to spread development costs across multiple products. It is also a slow poison that destroys brand identity. Under Lee Iacocca, Chrysler embraced badge engineering with an enthusiasm that bordered on the pathological. The K-car platform spawned dozens of derivatives. The Plymouth Reliant became the Dodge Aries with a different grille. The Plymouth Caravelle was a Dodge 600 with different trim. The Plymouth Sundance was a Dodge Shadow. The Plymouth Acclaim was a Dodge Spirit. On, year after year, the same cars wearing different badges. At first, this seemed reasonable. Chrysler was fighting for survival. They could not afford to develop unique vehicles for every brand. Sharing platforms and components was simple economic necessity. But the sharing went too far. A buyer walking into a Plymouth showroom in 1987 would see vehicles that were virtually identical to the Dodges being sold down the street. Same bodies, same engines, same interiors. The only differences were grills, taillights, and badges. And the Dodge versions often came with sportier marketing, making Plymouth seem like the boring choice. Worse, the pricing was nearly identical. The whole point of Plymouth, dating back to Walter Chrysler's original vision, was to be the entry-level brand, the affordable option. But badge-engineered Plymouths cost almost exactly what badge-engineered Dodges cost. Why would anyone choose Plymouth? The minivan was a perfect example. In 1984, Chrysler introduced the Plymouth Voyager and Dodge Caravan as revolutionary new vehicles. They were the same vehicle in almost every respect, built on the same assembly line, using the same components. The Voyager outsold every previous Plymouth minivan or station wagon by a wide margin. It was a genuine success, but the Caravan outsold the Voyager by nearly 2-to-1. Dodge had a more aggressive marketing presence, a sportier image, a stronger dealer network. Plymouth got the same product, but less than half the sales. Throughout the 1980s, this pattern repeated. Plymouth and Dodge shared platforms, shared engines, shared everything that mattered. Dodge usually won the sales contest. Plymouth fell further and further behind. There was one exception, one bright spot in Plymouth's otherwise dimming lineup: the Prowler. The Plymouth Prowler was unlike anything else in American showrooms when it debuted for 1997. It was a factory-built hot rod, a two-seat roadster with cycle fenders exposing the front wheels, a raked windshield, and styling that evoked 1930s customs. It was built with an aluminum body, advanced manufacturing techniques borrowed from the Dodge Viper program, and the kind of attention-grabbing design that Plymouth desperately needed. The Prowler was supposed to be the beginning of a Plymouth revival. The brand would be repositioned around heritage designs, retro-styled vehicles that appealed to nostalgia while incorporating modern technology. The PT Cruiser, with its 1930s-inspired bodywork, was originally conceived as a Plymouth. But there was a problem with the Prowler. It had a V6 engine. Hot rodders wanted a V8. The whole culture of American hot rodding was built around big displacement V8s rumbling through side pipes. The Prowler's 3.5-liter six-cylinder, even when upgraded to 253 horsepower for $1999, could not deliver that sound, that presence, that connection to tradition. Sales were modest. Chrysler built fewer than 12,000 Prowlers over 6 years of production. It was a halo car, a vehicle that attracted attention to showrooms, but did not generate significant revenue by itself. And before the PT Cruiser could save Plymouth, the brand was already doomed. In 1998, Chrysler Corporation merged with Daimler-Benz to form Daimler-Chrysler. The deal was presented as a merger of equals, two great automotive companies combining their strengths to compete in a global market. It was nothing of the sort. Within months, it became clear that Daimler was in charge. German executives took over key positions. American managers were pushed out or marginalized. The merger of equals was a polite fiction covering what was effectively a German acquisition of an American company. The new leadership had no sentimental attachment to Plymouth. They did not remember the Depression when Plymouth saved Chrysler. They did not remember the forward look when Plymouth led American automotive styling. They did not remember the Roadrunner, the Superbird, the rapid transit system. They saw only the current numbers, and the current numbers were grim. By the late 1990s, Plymouth sold fewer than 200,000 cars per year. This was down from a peak of nearly 973,000 in 1973. The Voyager sold at half the rate of the Caravan. The Breeze sold at half the rate of the Stratus. The Neon was literally the same car as the Dodge Neon, sold at the same dealers at the same prices, with only badges distinguishing them. There was nothing unique about Plymouth anymore. The Prowler was the last model exclusive to the brand, and it was not selling well enough to justify the brand's existence by itself. On November 3, 1999, Daimler-Chrysler President Jim Holden announced that Plymouth would be discontinued at the end of the 2001 model year. "This was an emotional decision," Holden said, "because Plymouth will always be an important part of our heritage." The German executives at Daimler-Chrysler presumably nodded politely. Heritage was nice. Heritage did not pay the bills. The response from dealers was muted. Most of them sold Dodge and Chrysler products alongside Plymouth. They would simply stop selling one of the three badges. Their customers, for the most part, would not notice. A few dealers were not so fortunate. 3 dealerships in the United States sold only Plymouth vehicles. They would have to find new franchises or close their doors. One of them, in Pennsylvania, had been selling Plymouths for over 40 years. The dealer was reportedly in shock at the announcement. The remaining Plymouth models were parceled out to other brands. The Prowler became a Chrysler. The Voyager became a Chrysler. The Breeze was simply discontinued, replaced by a redesigned Dodge Stratus and Chrysler Sebring. Only the Neon remained as a Plymouth for the final model year. The 2001 model year was a shadow procession for Plymouth. The only vehicle still wearing the Mayflower badge was the Neon, a car so thoroughly badge engineered that it shared its name with its Dodge counterpart, Plymouth Neon. Dodge Neon. Same car, same assembly line, same everything. Darrell Davis, the Daimler Chrysler executive who would ultimately purchase the final Plymouth, submitted his order months before production ended. He wanted a Prowler. The Prowler would have been a fitting end, a car that represented what Plymouth might have become if given the chance. But the Prowler had already been transferred to Chrysler for its final years. So Davis ordered a Neon, fully loaded, bright silver metallic paint, dark slate, gray leather interior, 5-speed manual transmission, power sunroof, CD changer, every option the order form offered. The car was built on June 28, 2001, the last of 38,657 Neons produced that model year. It was loaded onto a truck, shipped to Florida, and delivered to a dealer who had been instructed to touch nothing. Davis drove to the dealership, inspected the vehicle, and drove it 48 miles to storage. The radio antenna remained in its packaging. The owner's manual remained sealed. The window sticker remained on the glass. 20 years later, it was still there. The final Plymouth was not celebrated. There was no ceremony at the plant, no executives giving speeches about 73 years of history. The workers who built it were already building Dodge Neons on the same line, doing the same jobs, using the same tools. Only the badges were different. In the months that followed, the Plymouth name disappeared from dealerships across America. Signs came down, literature was discarded, service departments updated their records. Within a year, it was as if Plymouth had never existed. The Mayflower had finally reached the end of its voyage. Drive through any American city today, and you will still see Plymouths. Not many, but some. A Valiant here, a Duster there, an old Voyager still hauling groceries. The cars were built to last, and some of them have. At car shows across the country, the Roadrunners and Barracudas and GTXs draw crowds. Owners polish chrome, adjust carburetors, tell stories about when these cars were new, when you could buy a Hemi for a few $100s extra and outrun almost anything on the road. The muscle cars have become artifacts of a particular moment in American culture, when gasoline was cheap, regulations were light, and the automobile industry was willing to sell absurdly powerful vehicles to anyone with cash. The Superbirds have become objects of veneration. Only 1,935 were built, and many were modified or destroyed over the decades. Surviving examples with original equipment command prices that would have astonished the dealers who once discounted them just to clear the lots. A Hemi Superbird in good condition is worth more than most houses. Even the Prowler has found its audience. The car that disappointed hot rodders with its V6 engine has become a collector piece, appreciated for its audacious styling and its role as Plymouth's last gasp at relevance. Owners modify them, swap in bigger engines, make them into the hot rods they were always meant to be. And Christine still runs late at night on cable channels, the possessed 1958 Fury killing teenagers in the dark. Stephen King chose a Plymouth because it was a forgotten car. He gave it a kind of immortality that no marketing department could have engineered. But these are remnants, echoes. The brand itself is gone. What killed Plymouth? The easy answer is badge engineering, and that is not wrong. When every Plymouth was identical to a Dodge at the same price, there was no reason for Plymouth to exist. The brand's identity was diluted to nothing, but the badge engineering was a symptom of a deeper problem. Plymouth was never given the resources to succeed on its own terms after Walter Chrysler died. It was always the corporate stepchild, receiving hand-me-down designs, sharing platforms with Dodge, competing for attention within its own company. The irony is brutal. Plymouth saved Chrysler during the Depression. Plymouth was the only brand to see sales rise when every other automaker was collapsing. Plymouth funded the development of the vehicles that would carry Chrysler through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and in return, Chrysler slowly strangled Plymouth to death. There is a lesson here about brands and identity, about the difference between a badge and a meaning. A brand is not just a name on a grill. It is a promise, a personality, a reason for customers to choose you over someone else. When that reason disappears, the brand follows. Daimler Chrysler learned this lesson the hard way. Within a decade of killing Plymouth, they had sold Chrysler to a private equity firm. The merger of equals had been a disaster. German and American corporate cultures clashed. Products suffered. The company that was supposed to be stronger together was weaker apart. Chrysler went bankrupt again in 2009, rescued this time by Fiat. Today it operates as part of Stellantis, a multinational conglomerate headquartered in the Netherlands. The Chrysler brand itself is hanging by a thread, reduced to a single model that may not survive the decade. Perhaps this is fitting. Chrysler killed Plymouth. Now, Chrysler faces its own mortality. For those of us who remember the Mayflower on the hood, who learned to drive in Valiants and Satellites and Dusters, who watched Richard Petty win races in that blue number 43 Superbird, Plymouth's death still stings. It was not inevitable. It was not necessary. It was a choice made by executives who saw costs and benefits, but not history, not meaning, not the 73 years of cars that had earned the loyalty of millions of American families. The final Plymouth sits in a climate-controlled storage facility in Florida, 68 miles on the odometer. Window sticker still attached. It is worth more than any neon should be. Not because of what it is, because of what it represents. The end of something that mattered.